Welcome back. So, when I started this conversation, the first thing I was pointing out is that one of the things that they tried to do with Star Trek Voyager was differentiate the Delta Quadrant from what viewers were familiar with, which is the Alpha Quadrant. And that makes sense. So, one of the ways they really wanted to diverge from that was to make the Delta Quadrant kind of a wild, uh, untamed, unstable place. And so that's why, to make it as much of a contrast from the Alpha Quadrant as possible, because the Alpha Quadrant is a quadrant of empires. You know, you have the major players like the Federation, the Klingons, the Romulans, the Cardassians to a degree. And the fact that these major powers sometimes have these massive catastrophic wars is balanced by the fact that you have, because of the detente between them, you have long periods of peace. The Delta Quadrant, on the other hand, has no stabilizing influence. Uh, Further, those who live in this part, in the what I refer to as the Ocampo region, um, is all the regions that Voyager encounters from Caretaker all the way to season three's episode Fair Trade. After that, they enter in this region called the Necrid Expanse, filled with plasma storms and a lot of spatial anomalies. And I think that's a good in-story reason to keep this area kind of self-contained. It's kind of a creative sandbox. And more than that, explain why the Borg hasn't come through. And that, so it kind of creates this natural hedge that has protected these species from the Borg. But these species have problems of their own, and their problem is the Vidiians. So, as I talked about in my last video, how the Vidiians could be great, the Vidiians had the potential to be all-time all-time great Trek antagonists because they had such a compelling motivation, which made them capable of horrific atrocities, but also at the same time capable of invoking sympathy from the audience, which is what you really need in a great, compelling long-term villain. I talked a little bit about my suggestion that they should have had a kind of counter Voyager, an anti-Voyager Vidiian crew that would be doggedly pursuing them over the course of these first couple of seasons, slowly degenerating under the phage in a quest to get a cure via Belana Torres. But much is made about how the Vidians um, basically attack other species to harvest their organs to replace for their own. But that doesn't really make much sense when you think about it below the surface area. I mean, yeah, it's a scary concept, and it allowed them to do some really great things with the makeup on the Vidians to give them this really kind of horrific experience. And so you could play that they're actually their outside's reflecting their inside, like in Faces or in Deadlock, or you could show the dichotomy of that on the inside they're not monsters at all, but people dealing with a horrible disease, like in Life Signs. Um, but when you think about it, it doesn't make much sense. The Vidian population, even after the phage, they're a spacefaring civilization, so you could assume they live on more planets than just their home world. So you got to say their populations, at least in the hundreds of millions. To do that, and considering that the phage doesn't consistently affect everyone the same, like it's not like you lose your liver, then you lose your eyes, then you lose your lungs. It happens differently. So the problem would be how would you maintain the scale, even with rating other races for body parts? How would you ensure that you had the parts that you needed in order to meet the demand? You might end up with a surplus of Talaxian kidneys, but what you really need is some Ocampa livers. Uh, so when you take what the Vidians are doing just one step beyond, you see that actually they're involved in something much darker. One of the things Neelix references in her first appearance is that the Vidians, before they began attacking other races, would prowl sites and battlefields to pick off the dead and scavenge off the dead. Well, the easiest way to scavenge off the dead is to ensure that there's a lot of them. and the easiest place to hide a murder is in the war. My theory is that if you look at the timeline, the phage took over about 2,000 years ago. At that time, there were two we know of. There was only one other spacefaring species that we know of, and that's the Sicarians. The Talaxians have been spacefaring culture with warp capable since about the 1400s. The Sicarians going back to antiquity, and of course the Vidiians 2,000 years ago. You don't know much about the other races about that time. Moving ahead, we know that the robots from Prototype, their progenitors, the builders, the Kravik and the Pravlor, became extinct about 30 years ago. We know that the Kazon rebellion against the Trabe occurred about almost 30 years ago. And we know that during that same period of time, towards the end of that period of time, the Haconians defeated the Talaxians with the Metreon Cascade. Again, really, things in the Delta Quadrant really started to go to hell around 20 to 30 years before Voyager got there. As a result, you have a region that's filled with instability. You have the Benayans who are at war with the Numeri, as seen in the episode Ex Post Facto. You have the Mokra who are dominating and oppressing the Osurians, as seen in the episode Resistance. The Prelor and the Kravik from Prototype. And this is in addition to the Kazon, the ongoing conflict between the Kazon sects and the conflict between the Kazon and the Trabe, and on top of the Haconians who fought a long and brutal war with the Talaxians. Now, getting back to the Talaxian War, in the episode Detrail, which is one of the better episodes of Season 1 and the best Neelix episode, Neelix's description of events seemed to indicate that this was a war of choice for Talax, that Neelix didn't believe in the causes of war were worth dying for. And it wasn't until after the Cascade that he joined the Defense Forces. This would indicate this is a war of choice on Talax's part. Now, it also seems from a lot of Neelix's positions with the Kazon that we can kind of infer that the Talaxians had at least a good trading relationship with the Trabe, which would kind of explain why Neelix seems to have such a trade point of view in the episode of Alliances, and also why he seems to go out of his way to screw over his Kazon friends, as we also see in the past, as we see in Caretaker and in Alliances. So with the Haconians and the Talaxians, we never give an explanation of what their war is about. But my theory is that the Vidiians were behind it. That the Vidiians not only aided Jal Sakur and from the scenes quietly aided the Kazon in overthrowing the Trabe, but that set in motion, the fall of the Trabe set in motion a chain of events which threatened the Talaxians' power and position as traders, which brought them into conflict and competition with the Haconians. A brutal war which the Vidiians also encouraged from the sides, playing both sides off against each other in order to collect more bodies. This destabilization of the region played a role in the rise of the Mokra and their domination of the Osurians, who I believe, reading somewhere, justified their domination of the Alsarians as protecting our Alsarian neighbors from mutual enemies. That's good rhetoric in an area this wild and chaotic and destabilized. But if you look at it, the amount of wars going on between species, as I said before, the Numeri and the Benayans, the Mokra and Alsarians, the Prelor and the Kravik. Those are three war zones that Voyager crosses through in the first two seasons, in addition to the aforementioned Kazon conflict. So I believe the Vidiians have been behind the scenes instigating, encouraging, and prolonging these conflicts between these various races to destabilize the region in order to better harvest and secure the organs that they need in order to survive. It's the only way that the model they're set up with would function, And it would also make sense and explain just why everything has gone completely to hell in this region of space, except for one group of people. There's only really one spacefaring, established, long term civilization in the Ocampo region that has not suffered some sort of tragedy or ecological disaster like the aliens from the Thaw, or some sort of cataclysmic event, and that's the Sicarians. The Sicarians are the only race who are shown to have been warp capable before the Vidiians, and probably were cultural contemporaries of the Vidiians who were considered to be incredibly artistic. Uh, Sicarians to this day still have no problems. They're not expansionistic. They don't seem to be threatened by their enemies because they happen to be born on a planet with a resource that gave them a technological advantage. The Sicarians created the phage, and the phage set the stage for the destabilization of an entire quadrant. And so, what I really would have loved for Voyager to have done was to play with this, to learn the history of how the Vidiians have been behind it all. And it would be in a way that would make sense according to the motivations of all the different parties involved. And you could have taken season 1 to 3 of Voyager and made it this sandbox where you could have slowly, through episodes, even episodes where the Vidiians weren't directly involved and the Sicarians weren't directly involved, they'd be indirectly involved later through the outcomes and through the ramifications of things that occurred with the other species. Um, the Vidians' power level makes them more than formidable and able to do this, and their advances in medical technology could easily be explained because for the past, 30 years, they have been responsible for incalculable amount of death and suffering in the quadrant, and that's just on the backside. On the front side, with actually instigating these conflicts, they've done so much more. So that's my theory. I think it could have been an incredible opportunity for Voyager to show the epitome of evil and desperation through the Vidians on one side, and an even more horrible possibility that the Sicarians did it all just because they were bored. And really, what's more terrifying than complete indifference? So there you have it. I'd love to hear your comments on it. I think it's the only way that the seasons 1 and 2 and the different situations they run across and the different species they come across make any kind of coherent sense, and I think opens countless story opportunities. But let me know what you think, and take care. Have a good night.